Hello everyone, today we talk about the Han Chinese army organization, training and tactics that in the future will bring us also to battles and arms and armor. It's not really the first time we talk about Han military organization, but today we start with this sort of more comprehensive review. That was in fact the only video I think I've ever made about Han warfare. You know that I have this series on the Chinese armies from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and it's likely that we're going to expand also on Far Eastern, Asian, modern, contemporary warfare. This from this year onwards. Of course, the objective is to cover all military history in depth. However, the most important thing is just starting, going step by step, orderly and meaningfully. So today we partially introduce the Hans as this enormous military in the history of the art of war, paralleling essentially the Roman one between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd AD. It's not the first time that we analyze Chinese armies, also in comparison with the Western equivalents of the era. We have seen in this way actually lots of interesting things. But there is a lot to discuss today, so let's go again step by step. The collapse of the Qin dynasty in 221 BC ushered China into a period of significant chaos, dismantling the centralized power that had briefly brought the empire together under its strict legalist rule. The Qin ascended through relentless military campaigns and administrative reforms, but they fell victim to internal strife and overreach after the death of their powerful founder, King Shi Huang, in 210 BC. This resulted in a power vacuum that ignited a chaotic struggle among local warlords and military leaders vying for control over different provinces in a violent struggle reminiscent of a free-for-all. The upheaval disbanded the fragile unity of the Qin, returning China to a fragmented condition akin to the Warring States period that preceded it. Amidst this chaos, the early foundations of Han military strategy and imperial governance began to emerge, chiefly propelled by a remarkable individual, Liu Pang. Liu Pang, who started as a low-level police officer from Jiangsu province, exemplified the opportunistic nature of the era. Charged with the task of escorting condemned prisoners, he defied expectations by freeing them from their bonds, transforming these outcasts into a devoted band of brigands. This audacious move earned him the swift loyalty of his new recruits, who began to see him as a charismatic leader akin to a condottiere. To solidify his group's loyalty, Liu Pang used his own blood to anoint the drums and adopted a blood-red standard symbolizing both his authority and the warrior spirit of his cohort. Leading this unconventional force, he carved out his own domain in Jiangsu, seizing the opportunity presented by the surrounding chaos. By 207 BC, Liu Pang's ambitions extended beyond mere banditry. He advanced into the Shanxi region, gaining control not by sheer force but through the support of the populace, orchestrating a takeover similar to an Anschluss, a voluntary annexation fueled by his rising reputation rather than through military intimidation. This success initiated his rivalry with Xiang Yu, a powerful aristocratic general whose own forces sought dominance in the aftermath of the Qin dynasty's fall. Over 5 years, the two engaged in a series of campaigns that tested Liu Pang's ingenuity and resilience. Initially comprising convicts and irregulars, his forces were transformed into a disciplined army capable of taking on Xiang Yu's more conventional military. In 202 BC, Liu Pang achieved a decisive victory over his opponent at the Battle of Gaixia, a success accomplished through strategic foresight and by exploiting Xiang Yu's overconfidence. rising to prominence as an uncontested ruler. The son of a commoner, once merely a functionary, rose to become the emperor of China, founding the Han dynasty under the title Han Kao-tzu, named after the Han River. The Han Empire, which emerged from Liu Bang's unexpected ascent, lasted until 220 AD, spanning over 4 centuries, and significantly shaping Chinese civilization. Its durability and impact were grounded in the military and administrative frameworks that developed from these tumultuous beginnings, merging the irregular tactics from Liu Bang's early battles with the more consolidated power following the collapse of the Qin. Not only restored unity, but also established a cultural heritage so influential that people in China still identify as the sons of Han. This transition from disorder to imperial rule laid the ground for the sophisticated military practices that defined the Han era, reflecting vibrant interplay of opportunism, popular support, and martial ingenuity. As a first comparison with the Roman Empire, you understand how different these beginnings are. What we already highlighted in other videos is that regardless of the broader width of what would become, in fact, the Han ethnic group, right, and so the Chinese national identity, so to say, the size of the country and its enormous demographic and agricultural resources did routinely trigger political upheavals in Chinese history that are as cyclical as violent, and that fundamentally have a lot to do with the longer-term kind of, say, decentralization of power and privatization of the same. There is a pattern here that is really actually similar to the Roman one, right? But the latter was a system that managed essentially to control a much broader one from a narrower national basis, right? And in fact, achieving, in that sense, a balance and an order that was really in position of a nation over others in an overlordly fashion. China, in this sense, had actually a more subject population from a psychological point of view, socially. Again, you don't have that European tribal warlikeness, right? The Chinese do have themselves this sort of warlike background in their ancestral history that at some point we will see better existed in the same Han times, and not only, right? There are, beast warriors, there are very strong, especially feudal military ethos that in this sense are slightly different from, or consistently different from, the Roman more sort of citizenry-like, but also formally tribal egalitarian one. The Chinese system was more dependent on bureaucracy. From early times, the majority of people were peasants, but in a deep sort of subjected sense of de facto serfdom. The Roman world was substantially different, right? Slavery, of course, existed across the system. The systems are comparable, yes, but the difficulties in documentation suggest that while there was definitely a great, administrative force capable of regulating the agricultural surplus, like redistributing it across the empires, etc., the level of urbanization seems to have been less civic-based than the Roman one, to say the least. As the military was more the product of a generalized levy of different areas revolving around a more core professional military levied by a stattal system that was in the hand of very few people in ways that are more pronounced than even just the oligarchic Roman system. There was sort of way more, in fact, Republican in mindset, at least for what we intended, senatorial power sharing. Probably also with less, the Romans had less state at this point, especially up to, in fact, the existence of the same hand in the beginning of the 3rd century. So it was a very different a very different system where the Chinese population at large were sort of less spent, less militarized compared to Europe's. But there is also an older social stratification that owes much to an oligarchic control, say, blended in, merged in with a statalistic outlook that allows to develop very advanced military, as we will see now, for example, with a great importance of cavalry, right? But that is, in fact, a bit more ad hoc, concentrated. It does stem essentially from the capacity of this or that ruler to keep the system together rather than a homogeneous framework that will allow simply the entire system to be in perfect balance at all times for centuries. Of course, this can be criticized to a degree, but we understand better what are the differences with the West. Talking specifically of military organization, that again, in part we've already seen, but now we will resume a little bit again. Now, the military system of the Han Dynasty is definitely a testament to their administrative expertise, as evidenced by the thorough records in the Chu-yan bamboo strips. At the top of the military hierarchy were the field army commanders, known as Shang-chun or Ta-chun, who reported directly to the emperor. It might also be responsible for overseeing military regions or provinces. Below them, specific armies were led by officers known as Chang-chun or generals. These armies were further divided into various areas commanded by lower-ranking generals. This is also another important difference with the Roman Empire, that at large had sort of a surely decentralized system of rule, but still from, again, this hegemonic people that routinely also did settle in the outer provinces as a ruling establishment, but was fundamentally connected with a specific center and did not see the rule of a province fundamentally just as, I'm detached from the system, and or I'm simply landed there because that's the only system that the emperor can fundamentally control that province, right? The capacity of the general military to remain tied to imperial control, like it's evident in the Augustan system, is different in China. It's not really present. Now, these armies, in fact, were further divided in China into various areas commanded by lower-ranking generals in turn. So it's really more of a feudal system based on districts, right, than a permanent military that receives control just from the center and is permanently stationed across a particular frontier, like it could be just the Rhine or the Danube. These Chinese divisions included the vanguard under the Qian-chun, the left wing led by the Ts'ao-chun, the right wing under the Hou-chang, and the rear commanded by the Hou-chang, all of which received administrative support from the Li-chun, or general staff. This other aspect is yet very important. The Romans did not have a sort of winged formation that corresponded to different honorary offices. All right, the Roman legion was really ideally the homogeneous force supported by auxiliaries that maintained a single core. Right, so just the dignity of these Chinese generals was something above, like that sense of uniformity of the Roman leadership, like that idea that they all emerged from the same stock and responded just to Rome rather than deriving honors from local command, even when delegated by the emperor. The Roman legate had sort of a more direct control over the entire force, had to share power with the less subordinates that were not intended in this sense just as an expression, let's say an equivalent of different division of the legion. All right. There could be, again, overlappable tasks in terms of how many troops a single commander in a certain operation would have, but it's different from this more crystallized Chinese system of honors and local administration. It's in many ways, again, easier to govern over China. For those who have more means to remain in power, the Romans are de facto like subjugating an entire world and then keeping it firmly under control from a single ethnic background that eventually does dilute, but up to this point also contemporary to the Han's remains centered in Italy. In China, you could have, in this sense, a trickier system because everything was Chinese, but for this reason, those who had those regional power could be less trustworthy. Surely the Han's implement policies to control, of course, this local magnates that are in charge of the local army as well. But as you understand, it's a more delegated system, a more decentralized system than the Roman one, paradoxically, right? Because, again, the Romans had less bureaucracy than the Chinese, but still they could control things in a more unitary fashion from a single center. That's actually a very big divide in terms of actual moral force of the single people. And the word colonels, the Ts'ao Wei, operating outside the normal command structure, primarily functioning as administrative officials instead of battlefield commanders. Again, these are other military administrative offices. The fundamental unit of Han military organization was the Tu-wei-fu, or battalion, which each chun or army typically consisting of 3 such units, according to the records in the Chu-yan strips. This is actually a very similar system to a Roman cohort, right, with essentially 3 companies making it up just like the Roman maniples that keep existing also in the imperial era as administrative repetitions of the cohort, but surely tactical units proper. This is something that we already highlighted in the other video. Interestingly enough, these, in fact, units within the same Tu-wei-fu would be the most tactically relevant ones, as the companies technically were. But this battalion was complete tactical force that can, in fact, enact a combined armed tactics where you could have, the enemy pinned down with one company, then another outflanking it, the other remaining in reserve at Similia. We do not know, unfortunately, too much about the same Roman cohortal tactics. I talked a little bit about that, but there are different suggestions of how, in fact, these units could operate. The important thing was maintaining a tactically complete, properly occupation force, like in the size of a battalion or more, that could thus rely on itself in sort of complex strategic and tactical circumstances. Here, by the way, there is no fixed amount of companies. At some point, 3 would have been typical, but they may have varied. As we will learn later, Chinese Han armies were not as relatively standardized as the Roman ones were in their organization. And it's part of the same aspect we were saying before. It was somehow different commanders / governors across China had a sort of discretional autonomy in levying a certain amount of troops differently from Rome that controlled essentially the specific amount of legions and other military personnel that had to be employed. Of course, some Roman governors would take different measures, but the fundamental importance of the Roman citizenship spreading across the empire, embodying that full legionary professional manpower, is something, in fact, different, as you understand, in such a ethnically homogeneous system like China. And so it affects also the sort of the way you organize the entire system, the fact that you can fundamentally levy different Chinese troops without too much difference in how you could co-opt them, etc. Each Tu-wei-fu battalion was commanded by a Tu-wei, who was supported by a Chang and Suma, and consisted of local troops, in fact, importantly enough, local cavalry, and mainly conscripted infantry. Thus, you understand this is a very different system from the Roman one already, where you have people enlisting somewhere in a core land of the empire, and then they could be stationed very far away, maybe remaining there, in fact, gradually contributing to the localization of Roman forces. With China, it's different. You recruit basically whatever you want locally. And yes, you can have other troops coming from other regions for different motivations during political upheavals, broader strategic policy, etc. But it's fundamentally a different concept of power, right? Stemming from mostly like a kin, in fact, everything laying under heaven as a single people rather than a veritable imperial domination. Of course, there were some regions that were more important, were ruling on other in terms of manpower, political centrality, no doubt, right? But the composition of this space is much more homogeneous from an ethnic, linguistic, or cultural, spiritual point of view than others. Within each Tu-wei-fu, there were several Hou-chang, or companies that were pointed out before, led by Yahoo. Each company was divided into 4 to 6 platoons, with each platoon containing 6 to 7 squads known as sui, each managed by a sui-chang and typically made up of up to 11 men, which is very similar to the Roman contubernium. As a matter of fact, we're not aware of something like in between, like to us, say that would be the platoon, or something a bit smaller. In fact, just maybe even too big to be a squad, so it probably was something between. Remember that we do not know too well China compared to Rome, that we also don't know that enormous much about in actual precise depth. However, here there is a similar organization, except for the fact that there is an in-between organic unit that we do not see in the Roman legions. Right, we have this bigger platoon. By the way, here we don't see the equivalent of a centuria, by the way. So one could argument maybe on this basis that the Romans had actually greater cohesion at the centuria level, so that they had the only smaller unit below was the contubernium, because this smaller units were cohesive enough to stay within a centurion, being led by a guy who was fundamentally at the head of 80 people at this point, at least if we pick the early imperial legion. Then, as you know, it varied over time. It could be 60 by the time of Polybius. That would be essentially when the Han rose to power. So this is debatable. It could mirror, again, such moral, cultural differences. However, we also don't know enough. The impression, however, is, yes, that there is some sort of less professional bias in the Han military at this lower level, especially if we're talking infantry, because they're sort of local levies rather than professional soldiers when just available at some point. And it's not like there were entire armies that were professionally drilled in that way. We'll see it better, but there is this sort of more hierarchical principle whereby it's not just like equal legions of equal Romans, just by civitas optimo iure, that rule over lots of different foreign countries. This is just the same Chinese that, according to the different status, affluence, manpower availability, tend to also increase or decrease the quality of the single armies, depending on the specific needs. Now, from each sui, the best fighter, roughly 1 in 10, was selected for transfer to an elite reserve unit referred to as the gallants from the Three Rivers, serving as shock troops, which is something we do not see in the Roman army, where you have a promotion forwards, mostly through the ranks, essentially as centurions, and not this, again, separation between legionnaires that may have existed. We do think, of course, that, I don't know, the first cohort was the strongest force, that even within the same cohorts it was a segmentation, equality of the troops, etc. But there is no such thing like a special detachment of special people that are detached from the mass and that do serve as a separate unit. This is a very, again, Chinese mindset. It's very sort of feudal. It's very privatistic. It's very elitistic. In a way, it perfectly mirrors that Chinese bias we were talking about before. Now, cavalry units. This was a thing that the Chinese had it sort of more pronounced, more sort of structured than in the Roman army. In part also because, remember, here there are less auxiliaries as a consequence. There is plenty of auxiliaries coming from the outside, but at large, you don't have, for example, like the typical Roman habit of having a very small, but very good, made an entire video about this, elite, essentially, cavalry unit. You and all the rest in the hands of the auxiliaries. The Chinese have their own fully and large and well-established cavalry units and traditions. They had to more regularly cope with the Central Asian nomads. The Romans had their encounters, of course, with steppe peoples for a long throughout their entire history. I discussed all this. We talked Sarmatians, also in relation to the Romans, etc. China is doing something different. It's doing something more dirigistic. It's sort of drilling, arming larger bodies of cavalrymen that, in fact, were conformed to the aforementioned organizational structure as well. There wasn't, at least as far as we understand, it wasn't like, again, for the Roman ala, like a smaller unit that is separated from the bigger infantry ones. It seems that cavalry followed roughly the same organization of the infantry forces in at least with some internal divides, but not in terms of much strategic difference. In fact, cavalry were directly detached from army headquarters to various levels like the Tu-wei-fu or Hou-chang, although we do not understand it too well. From a historical point of view, one recorded cavalry unit, for example, had of an unspecified type, consisted of 182 men, which is, as you understand, larger than the typical Roman legionary cavalry contingent, and suggests this sort of greater use of cavalry force, also from a properly ethnic Chinese background. Conscription, the main method of recruitment, extended to commanderies as well as semi-autonomous kingdoms within the empire, which did exist especially in its outskirts, but likely excluded the Chu-ko or dependent states that were in fact something different, like more like client states, vassals outside properly the Chinese heartland, establishing frontier areas once local rulers in fact accepted Han dominance. So just a bit like what you see in the Roman client states ruled by locals before the Romans eventually absorbed them in their Roman provinces. Except in this sense, the Chinese controlled also much more far away and relatively more escapable and volatile peoples, right? Because they dealt more with properly Central Asia. And so not just the outer fringe of the steppes in even relatively semi-sanitarized areas like in Eastern Europe, right, in antiquity. The earliest documented dependent state originated from a faction of Xiongnu in 121 BC. We will talk about these people. As you know, there is this pseudo connection with the Hans, etc. We will cover them in detail in a single video, multiple ones, but one part of this Chinese sort of, not just Chinese, but also the peoples that fought against China in our surroundings. And after 109 BC, cavalry units from Chu-ko, especially from border tribes, such as, again, the Xiongnu, increasingly became a regular part of Han forces as well, right? There is an earlier and deeper blend between the Chinese military and the Central Asian influences. At some point, again, the Chinese decide that they must import large amounts of heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley into actual China to breed it in a large scale. The Romans never did anything like this. They called it sometimes cataphracts without too much fortune, by the way, and they didn't really need larger sort of strategic reorganization of their military. It was all much more gradual. The Chinese could have this. Of course, it took time. Like these were different reforms over time, but let's say did bring to this more dirigistic centralization. Okay, we need much bigger cavalry that's created out of scratch, right? This kind of things. Under, of course, the influences of auxiliaries that had always been used by the Chinese, that they couldn't even quite fully control on the frontier. And so it's a different game. Hence also the greater Chinese cavalry use. Now, the aforementioned auxiliary groups, including the esteemed Wuan, who were employed across the empire from the mid-1st century, were used strategically on the northern steppes, where their specific equipment and tactics were, of course, advantageous. A similar approach was taken by the eastern Han in the south, where adverse climatic conditions led to reliance on local tribes. Well, China gets a bit more savage towards the south. It's less doubled. Most of, as you know, the greater force is in the north, is on the Yellow River basin. Now, for instance, the forces deployed to quell a rebellion in I-chou in 48 AD were primarily sourced from the nearby Pa commandery. So again, China was so big and relatively homogeneous that if you needed some troops to quell a rebellion, you simply could pick local subjects and from nearby and crushing them, if you had control over them, of course. The Han also enlisted various categories of convicts in their military ranks. As we've seen, this was the foundation of the Han military to a degree, which is also bizarre, and it tells you how sort of degraded the situation was at the end of the Qin rule, but how in this sense, you know, Chinese armies were much less framed into a general sense of institutional belonging compared to Rome, which is also, again, interesting, because as we've seen, the Qin had pushed too hard the sort of statalistic, legalistic approach that China had already sort of developed historically. And these forces, like the Lupin uses, are, I mean, like, I don't know, the one of Spartacus' revolt to a degree. So there are massive imbalances in these big, namely unitary systems, that at some point become even countercultural. As you see here, the Han rose to power successfully crushing more conventional but still aristocratic forces at large. In Rome, you understand how much more sort of egalitarian, but not just in the Roman civic sense, but properly considering the social fabric of European societies that are either more tribal or more homogeneously statal, like you can see in the Roman case, right? So again, the Romans, their legionnaires were essentially the product of what just up to a couple of centuries before were Italic warriors, Italic tribesmen. So the fact that eventually that system, as we've seen also with the system of the Sulci, etc., managed to have all these elements stick together under a strong sense of unitary Romanity, without even, you know, the bureaucracy of the late empire, for example, is really telling you about the much stronger and more direct involvement of this local soldiery in the civic system of the West. Right? In China, it's really different. It's not like the Romans did not enlist convicts, but this normally happened just in times of crisis, like when, I don't know, Hannibal was at the gates. There was the so-called tumultus, but it's so exceptional that in fact confirms the rule of something that practically never happened, right? On the contrary, like there was something so sacred about being a freeman and part of the Roman army, you couldn't really recur to convicts, as you know. Now, in China, common labor troops identifiable by their red robes, iron neck collars, and shaved heads, representing an alternative to execution, were assigned to menial duties like digging ditches, erecting fortifications, and serving as cannon fodder, so to say, in combat. You don't have this in the Roman army. In the Roman army, everybody has the honor of building the camp. It's a matter of huge individual pride. The legionnaires are free men, warriors in arms that are one body and do everything by themselves, right? You could have had, of course, the auxiliaries being employed for dirtier tactical roles at Similia, but at large, even those were considered as warriors. Here, there is no such thing like we're going to use criminals, convicts, lesser people for in the military to begin with. This tells you again how different Rome and China really were, and how China was sort of much more hierarchically stratified, with the habitual exploitation of larger masses of dispossessed just for making this enormous system go on, but without that much glue down to the individual level. That makes you really appreciate the Roman citizenry as also a cohesive tribal legacy, right, from the European continent. The more I went on studying European warfare, the more I realized how this background was important, and how wrong it is, by the way, to try, for example, to counterpose the Romans to, say, I don't know, the broader continental European tribes in ethos and in origin, which is just, unfortunately, a product of not just the 19th century social Darwinism and pseudo-racialistic history, but it's more like, I don't know, we mythologize the differences between Europeans when we were actually, and still are, pretty homogeneous, even in our own linguistic and cultural differences. That's something really striking about Europe, right? That such cohesion can occur historically compared to any other people, while all pursuing sort of different directions at the same time. It's really striking. This is it's actually reflecting at least the extra gear that Europe has as a civilization in the world since antiquity. This, however, doesn't mean that the Qi, Xing, or amnested convicts in the Han army were not too good soldiers. I mean, they often took on combat roles improved on different occasions to be fierce fighters, even without extensive military training, which is something that you can find also in other cultures. There are parallels we could draw. Again, it's just, as I was saying before, think about Spartacus' revolt, and think about gladiators, slaves, etc. There are reasons, ways like the sense of redemption through the exercise of arms. It was offered to you. We've seen it also for gladiators, non-free, that they had to win their freedom with those kind of fighting. So these are indeed, across Eurasia, importantly shared senses of freedom, of warriorhood, etc. Just they are differently calibrated in different cultures. Pioneers in the Han army serving as static garrison forces made up of armed farmers stationed at the borders and the Great Wall would cultivate nearby areas when off-duty, drawing parallels to the Roman troops, however, of the later 4th and 5th centuries, the Limitanae/Ripenses. This is yet another indicator that the Han army was sort of a bit more degraded by some degree in militia, landed militia levy troops that were considered part of the military, but as a matter of fact were just sort of part-time soldiers, right? Mostly farmers settled in some strategic areas. This is very different from also the early Roman military colonies that were truly understood to be those colonies would be exempted from military service because they, just by living on the border, out on the border, they would be more exposed. This is relatively similar, but the quality of these troops is indeed lower, right? We're talking pioneers. In that case, the Romans had fully fledged like Roman freemen and soldiers that, in case of levy, they could still voluntary they would take on much more sort of professional roles in their military. It wasn't that division in the Roman army. It's true that that doesn't become fully professional until Marius, but you can argue that already like from the 3rd century BC we are in that reality, and in any case the Romans had just emerged from centuries of practically unstopped conquest and sort of warlikeness and social militarization, something from a tribal background, again, very differently from these Chinese forces here that are basically peasants from a very long time. The Han military's diversity was further enhanced by specialized units, as highlighted in Chao Chung-wu's campaign against the rebellious Western Qiang in 61 BC. This army comprised serving prisoners, amnestied convicts, conscript infantry, quote, volunteer expert marksmen, which is interesting because, by the way, they're just missile, right? Surely noted for their remarkable shooting skills, possibly equipped with bows or crossbows, because the Chinese did have that, as actually Europeans did have that. The Gastrafetes is not just out there for no reason. Though this detail is also unspecified, by the way, we don't know whether these units were specifically crossbowmen. We know of the Winged Forest Orphans, an elite infantry unit formed from orphans whose fathers fell in battle as well. So you understand here there is a customization, a personalization, almost a subjectivization of warfare that is unknown in the Roman military, where everybody is alike, just because they are part of this Roman soldiery in ways that basically nobody else can understand. This is the chosen race of God that had to subjugate any other system from a specific regional pool. Here, it's just Chinese subjects that are given it by the elite a chance of redemption, but just in contained numbers, and with, as you understand here, a lot of distinctions, a lot of segmentation. Additional forces in the Han army included the Liang Chia-tzu, that is noble-born elite cavalry, likely armored, right? So that we're talking about a level of feudalization, aristocratization of warfare that is unknown in Rome at this point. Doesn't matter how strong the Roman elite was in comparison. They served as commanders, mostly leading infantry units and other arms, mostly belonging to subjected peoples. Here we see instead, like it's as if, I don't know, the Romans of the 3rd century BC had gone at war with heavily armored horse just because, right? And that's not quite the case. It would have not been a distinct force from the legion, by the way, because we don't see that, right? There is no such thing in Rome. We have in China the Yunkan archers. We do not know much more about these, but they distinguish themselves along with barbarian cavalry as well, Chinese cavalry from 6 Western commanderies and Chang cavalry from a dependent state. This is normal. This is frontier, like it's more similar again to what the Romans had, again, from allied peoples outside of Italy, except these were normally similar to the Romans. Infantrymen, sort of more contained quantities of cavalrymen, more rarely large amount of forces from the steppes, like if any, like at least in that size. Needless to say, the Han military technology was quite advanced, right? It was really the expression of a very developed civilization. The Chinese employed artillery and long-range crossbows, which outperformed enemy weaponry and provided a significant tactical advantage in different circumstances. This is actually what also the Romans bragged about, but if you study this historiographically, you realize it's mostly like an Hellenistic legacy in Roman literature. So this idea that, like, I don't know, the Macedons had I don't know, I will have cataphracts, I will have elephants, I will have war chariots, I will have huge siege machinery, whatever, and they lost to the Romans anyway. The Romans really liked this notion of being innovators. It's actually the same source. People do not know that because they're ignorant for all that whining about the Romans copying other people. It's literally what the Romans made up about themselves, because they had to show basically that they had not just drawn stuff from other peoples, but that they had conquered, but that they had perfected their same technology. And it's a typical Hellenic mindset that actually the average Roman did not have at all, right? And we know this from, in fact, so many macroscopical factors in Roman culture in general, in military, that in fact tells you how the Romans were that kind of generally take the enemy head on, slaughter him, and not any other sophistry. But again, the notion that some Germanic chieftain would end up impaled to a tree, transpassed by a ballista bolt, was something that the Romans liked to toy at some point in their historiography themselves later on, like in the 1st and the 2nd century AD, right? We will at some point get a bit more into the depths of, say, Chinese artillery in Han times. Again, we will make videos about different units. Surely we will expand into more specific themes connected to this kind of weaponry. But as we know, ancient artillery wasn't anything like just medieval artillery itself, regardless of our imagery and how we tend to also to be technologistically biased ourselves. We're just supportive weapons. They did not make the thing, right? Everything is, even in the assaults of fortified position, about bodies, right? Having people assaulting, moral force, all the physical brutality, and that you can imagine. And so these weapons were just mostly showing off, helping, destroying this tower or another, while however the troops attacked, so which is a very different thing. Now, despite their organizational strengths, the effectiveness of Han armies, as we understood here, varied greatly. A decree from 90 BC pointed out poorly maintained defenses, undisciplined officers, and low troop morale as reasons for avoiding a northwestern campaign, which is something really that the Romans would have not tolerated. The Romans may have had different issues at some point, including, being defeated by a foe and needing to enlist new soldiers. This passed through political gaming that you're familiar with. But the notion, our armies suck, we can't launch an invasion, doesn't make much sense. Of course, Roman legions were of different quality, but it's evident from this Chinese example that the Hans had essentially a much more heterogeneous force, because it was meant to be different even within itself since the beginning, and it was mostly locally dependent. As a consequence, it was difficult to simply uniform it across China without a kind of imperialistic command over these other provinces the conqueror mentality that the Romans had on their own province and the lands that they controlled outside of their own. So this is a major difference. And in fact, that there is even a decree that this is not just, let's just enlist other troops, and rather, I expect the local military to have, here we are in 90 BC, by the way. So it's when the Romans were already very much colonialistically oriented, were just aware that they were out there in other people's countries. Here, it's not. It's more like the Chinese have this wide territory that is also different within its own Chinese, its Chineseness, let's put it in this way, but that is already settled, it's already landed, it's already something that, the army we have to rely on is whatever those guys in those provinces from centuries are about as Chinese military, right, for the empire to use. And so it's a completely different background from the Roman one. The defeat of two armies by the Xiongnu in 129 BC was attributed to insufficient training for newly conscripted soldiers, which is something that frankly can happen also, to different cultures. It's not so strange. Nevertheless, this may have been accentuated by the fact that the Han army were not just professional military like the Roman one. While Li Kuang-li's troops in 104 and 101 BC, these are the same years of, say, Aurasio, primarily consisted of young, quote, young men of questionable reputation, alongside skilled archers who had been released from prison. So, again, what kind of troops are these? What kind of social glue is there to this kind of Han forces when you're enlisting people of questionable reputation? Like, what does that actually even mean, right? That these are lesser people, criminals, whatever, and then in fact you have the skilled archers who have just gotten out of prison, and you just point that there are archers. I mean, the Romans didn't even care about their own archers. We do not know of archers in the Roman legion per se, because normally those functions were performed surely by some legionnaires, but that we do not explicitly know of. The true Roman could not be an archer. An archer is a light infantryman. It's a lesser being. At the beginning, like before the Marian Reform, you have in theory the velites, but the Roman military had already evolved from a century or so to something more uniformly like on the base of the princeps. That is what you say, also fully formalized by the Marian Reform. And he's a warrior. He's a guy with a sword. A heavy infantryman goes into melee that does not hit and run. And even less like a criminal can join this, right? So of course, lots of auxiliaries would have been archers, but in fact that was the lesser people the Romans had subjugated and performed those tactical roles exactly because they were not heavy infantry like the legionnaires. Not that there wasn't, of course, auxiliary heavy infantry, but that was also lower in quality than the Roman one. Surely, again, we are not too well informed about this. There would have surely been some Roman legionary archers of some sort here and there, because the same legionnaires would have adapted to using different weapons. But specific units, other than auxiliaries, in this timeline, before, say, the Constantinian Reform, also 1 century before the extension of citizenship basically to everybody that spoke Latin within the empire, you do not find a specialized element of Roman lighter infantrymen, except, again, the class of the velites that were truly technically lesser people that could not afford better equipment, right? This is extremely interesting as a comparison. Now, unlike, thanks to our Western documentation for Europe, estimates of Han China troop strength are often vague, right? While population censuses indicate there were hundreds of thousands available, reported figures such as 50,000 cavalry and several 100,000 infantry against the Xiongnu in 119 BC may represent nominal numbers rather than precise counts, or simply gross exaggerations. I mean, Wu could field 50,000 men in a tactically functional way. Maybe this could be different armies across a wide theater, but notoriously, like 50,000 men for an ancient army at large are a miracle to begin with. They're literally the top, the maximum, and even plus that 50,000 cavalry. I'm not even going to comment on the several 100,000 infantry. This doesn't make any sense. There would have been, of course, hundreds of thousands of men, a few, like 100,000 plus, like if you brought together different armies on a wide theater, right? The Romans did something similar during the Dacian Wars, so it's not so strange after all. It took a massive logistical system. Against the Xiongnu, it's a bit complicated because they are out there in the steppes, and so this makes this whole thing sound a bit even less reliable, to say the least. Nevertheless, we can spot some of these exaggerations. For example, as the Han-Shu notes that over 40,000 troops were termed, quote, 100,000 for a single campaign. This could happen also because certain units were under strength, so it would not be so strange. But when we talk about, again, more than, say, 30 to 50,000 men, we realized that whatever was beyond that was either another army separated from one, and that would have also needed some specific supplying space, right, and resources. They could have not been crammed all together literally in the same places, or at least if they were, they would have been out there just for very precise and controlled purpose. And in general, this eventualities were rare. This is not how normally the Han's needed to operate, right? Smaller armies and multiple ones were more agile, more effective, and we think that that's sort of the more likely thing. Naturally, bigger showdowns with 50,000 men were absolutely possible, again, in a single army. Yeah, sure. But at large also this big concentration meant you sent, say, an army of such size on the frontier against the Xiongnu. When these forces arrived there, they would also spread out, right, and operate differently in different theaters. This same goes for occupation forces of some sort. I don't know, think about what the Romans did with the Jews, right, or with any other people at some point rebelled and they had to put down, right? They were masters in counterinsurgency. And so the Hans, we think, like, because they had very good military, right? So this intricate multi-tiered military framework enhanced by varied recruitment strategies and specialized units highlighted the administrative and military sophistication of the Han dynasty nevertheless. Speaking of training, let's understand better what kind of quality was there behind these recruits. Now, the military forces of the Western Han consisted of three main groups, right? Because, again, also this empire was not fully unitary at some point. We had conscripts, convicts, and volunteers, with conscription forming the foundation of its military organization. So something very different from the professional Roman military. In the early years of the Han dynasty, all males between the ages of 23 and 56 were subject to conscription for a 2-year period of active duty. Although this age range could adjust based on specific circumstances, it costs a lot. It, if anything, evidences that differently from the Roman military that was at large essentially a volunteer-based force, and there would be conscription at some point, but just in cases of emergencies, the Hans were reliant on a sort of, I can recruit whomever I want, right, and will have them trained good enough so that in case of need, I just can't throw people into the meat grind. This does make sense because, again, it allows you, China is more controllable, more homogeneous at large. So while there are going to be revolts, you want to simply put them down, not maintaining like a very expensive military concentrated somewhere and eventually sending it out there to crush a rebellion. But just crushing the rebellion from troops that live nearby and that can put the rebels down. Also because the same rebels would have not necessarily been of a particularly high quality, especially if this were actually popular uprisings. They could have been, of course, civil wars with mutinies, with sort of open rebellions against the emperor, etc. That's another story. You have army against army. I mean, also the Romans went into much civil war, as you know. In any case, it's interesting that the Chinese had an idea of essentially universal military service. Most conscripts spent their first year engaged in training, followed by a second year serving with armies stationed at the capital, in various provinces, or at frontier garrisons. This is actually very serious. Right? It does. This is the Chinese response to the notion that every freeman, at least, must be able to use arms, not just to probably not bearing them, because China was surely, even Roman Europe was very disarmed, let's say, once the empire was established. China was likely more, in this sense, or at least there would be more people that were less likely just to be, less freemen properly, less likely to be in arms by themselves. However, as we've seen, their masters wanted them to have not just a basic erudition in the use of weapons, but to have essentially learned how to use it in a properly military context, learning from more advanced, like properly professional forces that would have been stationed mostly around the capital and sort of the main provincial centers. So again, these were not professionals, they were just militia of some sort, levies that could have been relied upon in times of crisis. It's a considerable cost at large. We can imagine, of course, compared to the professional elements of the Han army, that these troops would have been really scarce in quality. But it's already something that you could have so many of them, considering Chinese demographics, to solve many of your problems. Remember that the Romans relied within the empire on auxiliaries that came from within the same empire originally, then even from outside later on, as Romanization was progressing. The Chinese did not really have this. They didn't have anyone to China-size, and so they just would operate the same division between a professional, a core of professionals, and lots of conscripts. Like the Romans could conceive the auxiliaries by a degree, even though in a slightly less warlike sense, because the Romans at least mostly recruited barbarians that were habituated to kill each other like up to the day before, so they didn't even need to train them, at least in the basics of combat. If anything, just into Roman discipline and more. Now, the Chinese conscripts primarily served as infantry, while roles in the cavalry were typically filled by volunteers from noble backgrounds or by non-Chinese auxiliary forces. This is also very relevant because you see the same sort of, ethnic imperial element, so to say, and the auxiliary forces. Also, this means that the elite wants really to maintain control over the ethnic population that at large will not field more advanced forces. So you understand here how much more oligarchic and sclerotized the system is from a political and social point of view. You would also have a specific segmentation based on status, so differently from Rome, where everybody can become a soldier, and essentially, aside from command posts, basically they're all the same in terms of status. At large, they're all plebeians. This is true, but they're full Roman citizens, so they have properly, even in their way of fighting, a superiority over the other auxiliary forces. In China, you have a superiority of the nobility, properly as a different, creating a different arm from the rest of the population. That is instead some sort of levies that are technically not soldiery even. Of course, the Chinese had professional infantrymen in large numbers, so this is technically not fully true, but cavalry is more aristocratically pronounced as an arm in Han China compared, say, to Rome, where it's really reduced and not that relevant. If not, like, just you could even have the barbarians having them in large numbers compared to the Roman legionary, like the superiority of Rome, that would not create problems in terms of this balance, right? This is also true, actually, part for what we just observed for the sort of Central Asian cavalry. used by the Chinese. They would have been, however, lightly equipped, like horse archers, etc. So it's complex to analyze hand warfare just in a video like this because it does not immediately give you all the shades and also all the problems that we have in interpreting the system. There are big unknowns, etc. But the few indicators here do show like a very different story from the opposite end of Eurasia. Right? There is no doubt either, however, that the Han structure gave the Chinese army a significant advantage over the previous national military forces and many of its opponents. So the Hans really represented a hell of a force. We don't have to belittle, to degrade it. It, in some aspects, definitely surpassed the Roman one, as the Roman one did surpass it for others. At large, they were similarly balanced systems, probably, if you look at them. Probably with the Hans investing more on size, and especially in the moment, right, of the availability of these levies in case of need, whereas the Roman military preferred essentially an elite professional force, also containing number, to control the whole system. And Rome lasted more, right? Or at least, like, if we understand China, of course, being older and this imperial system too, that's a bit of a different story. But in great part, like, the Chinese system too had different upheavals that surely compare with the Roman civil wars, but there is even there a greater split of power within the same China, likely because of this decentralization compared to Rome. Now, as time went on, modifications, in fact, were made to the conscription system between 155 and 74 BC. The minimum conscription age was reduced to 20, reflecting a strategic decision to integrate younger recruits. The training regimen was intensive and ongoing, extending beyond just an initial boot camp period, which is definitely interesting. Each year in the 8th month, the entire army, regardless of rank or unit, took part in a general inspection and testing process. They needed, again, to rely on this part-time soldiery. All units were assessed based on their performance, and unit leaders faced strict penalties if troops did not comply with established standards. Given the high punishments for any shortcoming, we can understand that the system did have problems in that direction. We do not hear of this, for example, in the Roman military. That was particularly efficient, in part because also it was very contained in number. So obviously enough, if you count more on this local levies, it's, if they are comprehending the totality of able-bodied freemen, it's likely going to be less efficient, less qualitative. Now, this checking, this control practice, however, assured that training and combat readiness remained sustained focus throughout the Han era. And remember, most of these troops would have been actually employed in case of need relatively nearby. So this sounds something more similar to, certain medieval military systems than what we see in Rome, for example. If you're talking the levies, of course, the imperial professional element stationed around the capital, etc., was really a very strong strategic force that could project its control very far and wide, but it was still sort of part of this enshrined as massive demographic basin of China, and so had also a different purpose, right? Mostly one of maintaining power against any possible rebellion, right, insurrection, then having, like in the Roman case, a specific interest in balancing the control of populations within and outside the empire, so to say, even though that doesn't make sense in the Roman mentality. Like, they thought that their empire went as far as also beyond what we called the limes, that wasn't even properly called like that. To them, it was the monumentum, the sense of this armed forces there on the frontier to check those guys who were from one side and the other. As soldiers aged, certain Han policies regulated their service. Upon reaching 56 years of age, all low-ranking infantry and marines were designed as, quote, elderly and decrepit, which is not a very nice way to say goodbye. The Romans, even in their brutality and, lack of feelings, apparently they had sort of more, in fact, practical, straightforward ways. This seems like more an insult, like, I used you, like, you can't go away, like, you degenerated old man. So they were released from active duty, transitioning to civilian status. It wasn't that different in practice, but terms are interesting as well to understand mentality. Concurrently, selected former soldiers were organized into a local militia known as the Pen Ming, which could be activated in emergencies, thus creating a reserve force to bolster the active military. This was probably the backbone of the local levies, by the way, or at least those who could simply control the system from also some kind of wisdom. Like, as we've seen, these were essentially old men, but they would have had some charisma, some experience that would have been useful for managing the local militia in case of need. Now, this carefully structured approach to conscription, training, evaluation, and militia formation allowed, of course, the Western Han to sustain a highly disciplined and efficient military capability throughout their era. Speaking of tactics, of course, this would be better understood by looking at battles, specifically, which we will do on another occasion. But we discuss tactics here just to give an idea of more or less how the military that we just illustrated worked like. Right? As you understand, we do not know too well. Right? We know much more in proportion about the Roman military. Again, for reasons that are all part of the way different cultures describe themselves, preserve knowledge. Again, in the West, we had that more sense of individual liberty to the point that knowledge was shared more extensively, not just from a imperial bureaucracy, within an imperial bureaucracy for internal dispositions. We know much more about the West from people that had been soldiers themselves. Not too much, but still. So tactically, but also, let's say, the art of war, also strategy in general, like the strategy of the Han Dynasty as documented in battle accounts and theoretical texts illustrate a refined combination of traditional principles and practical adjustments, showcasing the dynasty's administrative capabilities and martial legacy. Han generals were significantly influenced by military theories from noted warring states strategists like the famous Sun Tzu and Pu-chih, along with numerous texts attributed to legendary historical figures. If you read them, you know that they have a few to do with what modern people often treat these sources like. Sun Tzu is a collection of anecdotes, right? It's something that has the same development of a text written at the time of Pythagoras, right? You think that Sun Tzu is the ultimate art of war manual that you can win a war through. Like, good luck with that. Like, I have my own avatar for a reason, but you must understand the radical difference in civilization and actual capabilities. I mean, Sun Tzu is a guy who says, or at least even if we assume that he was a single guy, it's a bit like Homer, like an entire story, goes to tell, like, never besiege a city. Yeah. You know, we are at these levels. It's just a collection of anecdotes. It's perfectly in line with what would have been conceived at the time, but that's how you have to take it. There's no doubt that this was a wisdom that came from different, ages of Chinese military practice. There's no doubt, but just the way it's described, it's something that, first of all, you can have equivalent texts in the West, like in terms of anecdotes of general understanding, even by reading the Bible, or I'm not kidding, or just obviously enough anything from classical literature that mostly talks about war, telling the truth, is an equivalent to this, but you cannot compare such a thing to the military theory developing at the time of Kant and Hegel in the Von Kriege of von Clausewitz. Whoever thinks, again, that Sun Tzu is the ultimate deal, I'm sorry, I made videos explaining why that is not the case, and especially why people must pretend that is, because fundamentally it's a less intelligent text, and so dumber people, of course, must justify themselves for being like that. And surely, like, whoever wrote that was very intelligent, not to say that it wasn't, but in fact, for these people to understand, and this is not how they should take it. Now, Sun Tzu's focus on deception and psychological tactics continued to be significant, though the Western Han period saw a shift towards a more bureaucratic military approach. Right, those earlier eras were still war chariots were out there in substantial amount. I made a video about the Zhou army, so if you're, interested in those previous centuries, I made something already about China, seeing where the Hans were coming from. Like, we were kind of still Chinese military culture were basically just implemented on themselves. But those were the times of the heroes, again, of the more like Bronze Age kind of vibe. By the way, when Sun Tzu says that you should never besiege a city, it has to do with that. The fact that the armies of his times had plenty of war chariots that were putting such a logistical strain on logistics that during a siege they could have made like the besieger forces collapse just out of that. Which unitly, however, is not presumably even how the things worked. I mean, sieges occurred even in Bronze Age with lots of chariots. So that's just a take. Like, that translated, in my opinion, you should not do such a thing, or even more in practice, like, be aware of chariots because they're that heavy and they cost so much. So in siege warfare, you can get bogged down more easily than you would think. And so there is not, of course, an internal coherence. They're just a list of anecdotes. It's not like a fully fledged military theory, nor something, again, that nobody at the time would have had the need or reason to write in that sense. We already explained this very much in those videos about even modern military treatises, because actually it's similar to what happens in the Middle Ages. Like, why weren't there military treatises at that point? Why also did they read, say, the Roman ones, the Chia-tzus? Well, it was enough to read those as a support, right, to your military insight, just even for curiosity or further reflection, almost a divertissement. But if you wanted to know how to use medieval armies, the best way was not military academies like in the modern age with bigger armies and sort of more concentrated power, just going out there with your army and learning, maybe with smaller war bands at the beginning and bigger armies later. It worked perfectly, and those who needed to learn about that would simply do it. So in part, this is what happened in China as well in those previous times. In Han's times, you have definitely more control, more power concentration. And so you tend, in part, to also to hyper-administrate, actually, all these resources, as you understand, even having this generalized levy system, a sort of reservist kind of background for all able-bodied freemen, corresponded to a statal vision, a different regime than before. It had just come into being. As we've seen, also the Qin had the sense of statalism and legalism. The three strategies of Wang Shi-kung were likely written during this era, arguing that, quote, the foundation of total victory in warfare lies in military administration, which is also in fact a sort of excess, a cliche, right, indicating a move away from the earlier emphasis on psychological warfare and sort of a more sort of direct involvement of the warrior hero, sort of champion leader of men. This is typically in line with the anthropological development of populations. Again, the Hans are sort of the equivalent of the Roman Empire, so they're very, very advanced and more modern, secularized than the previous counterparts. Prominent leaders, such as Chu-ping, known as, quote, the swift cavalry general, often disregarded ancient writings, focusing instead on tangible outcomes on the battlefield rather than theoretical approaches. So what we said before was true for the Hans, was true for the Romans. There are some lost military treatises from the classical era. I mean, even Augustus wrote a treatise on tactics. Unfortunately, they went lost, and those things that, frankly, do not make you feel very well to know. But we imagine that, of course, these treatises were, it's just like, I don't know, read even just historians from it, and realize how they would describe certain, especially from an Hellenic background, basically, warfare. And we did so very often on Schwerpunkt, reconstructing different battles from primary sources. And so we know also there what's a mean to which end, which is telling you just a part of the story and looking at specific aspects rather than others. There's also much greater logic in many ways. Chinese accounts are most poetic, a bit more, again, together with that nobiliar privatistic bias, a bit more idealized as well. Remember what we said about numbers before. It's normal. It's part of cultures that behave like this. It's just us that must understand that this doesn't mean that the Han military was not good and functional. You don't need a treatise explaining you how it really was. Nobody would have written it anyway, anywhere at the time in the world. But there is a reality that we try to reconstruct through sort of the meager evidence that we have. Now, a key aspect of Han military tactics was the use of missile weapons, as we noticed before, with some missile units literally singled out of the system, even with some kind of elite ambition. We have mentioned the existence of the crossbow, which outperformed the equipment of their rivals and became the main armament. This is quite relevant because the Chinese, as we've seen, were very involved against Central Asian peoples. We've seen it in different other Chinese warfare battles. We're talking about the enemies of China. And crossbows were pretty nasty against horse archers. As a matter of fact, this is the same that happens in the Middle Ages. You can argue that the same sedentary world in classical times knew how to cope with steppe peoples through combined arms. So this is really normal in many ways. But China, in the sense, as civilization, is superior to those forces, and the crossbow was surely in part an answer to that kind of mounted harassment coming from the steppes. But it's the Chinese would pass to the offensive, like in battles like the one of Sogdiana in 38 BC and Li Ling's campaign in 90 BC. We will see this operation. The part we have already seen in other videos, but we will at some point make a video about these battles/campaigns, because that's also mostly how the information comes packed all together. Crossbows were operated in formations protected by armored infantry equipped with large shields and long spears, which suggests actually a very high level of combined arms tactics, right? It's something almost medieval looking. There were even the famous halberds, right? The Chinese ones with that kind of piercing, fracturing, cutting capacity. We explained also in other videos about medieval Chinese warfare how that fundamentally worked. You can argue that Chinese infantry remained largely capable of operating with this, like there would be moments of infantry weakening in different, especially in the early Middle Ages. However, the notion of having long spears against cavalry, large shields against horse archery, and this counter missile capacity with crossbows adds all up, especially if you have heavy cavalry plus horse archers from your side, the latter mostly, as we've seen, auxiliary. We know that even armored cavalry sometimes carried crossbows, effectively acting as a sort of self-propelled artillery. We shouldn't exceed in that, but that's something I actually always pointed out for medieval knights as well. Probably the crossbow was a relatively frequent side weapon for knights from horseback. It's not just, of course, every knight knew how to perfectly operate a crossbow in any situation, but in fact, on the same horseback with some kind of horse archery capacity. This would have been more pronounced in China, especially on the frontier with the steppes. This focus on missiles weakened enemy lines, creating opportunities for decisive actions. Essentially, you soften up the enemy ranks, including other Chinese, because this system is primarily designed to fight against other Chinese, like in any other context, basically. In fact, Central Asians are not as good as the Chinese, but you can find, in fact, this tougher troops. You need to soften them up and then attack. Like, this is normal. This is what missile does. Chariots still existed, executing final attacks when the ground allowed, while cavalry carried out shock assaults on unsuitable terrain. Chariots were not like the protagonists of mounted warfare anymore, but they were still there, and I think that if you want to draw a parallelism, given that basically the last war chariots in the West are, aside from the far north or the Garamantes, etc., that were inconsistent forces. I mean, look at the Britons. Were last used in a coherent fashion, say, at a higher level play, so to say, by the Seleucids against the Romans in this period, Battle of Magnesia. They were big, all right, and they tried to basically to smash into the sturdier infantry formations of the time. Here, probably the Chinese, but they used it in the same way, telling the truth, but exactly like the purpose is more or less what had brought from the Bronze Age to have less chariots, but bigger ones, paradoxically, so that could smash against the same infantry that had basically largely brought to the end of chariot warfare, because they were sturdy enough to oppose them. But by now, it's really cavalry that leads mounted warfare. It's very well articulated. It's now, as we've seen, pretty numerous as well among the Chinese. It's very flexible. It has a level of, professional, of armored shock capacity that you cannot really replace with chariots that are much clumsier and effective in some circumstances, but more often not really. The cavalry played two main roles, acting as a reconnaissance and pursuit unit for the lighter component, let's say, encountering agile enemies like the Xiongnu by pinning their cavalry, thereby enabling infantry and chariots to close in. Infantry is still the queen of battle, even in China, right? This is true for antiquity at large. Again, Central Asians do not take over these sedentary civilizations exactly because they're stopped primarily by infantry. And even if the Chinese have strong cavalry at large, it's infantry that leads the game. As we've seen, command in Han military operations was primarily an aristocratic privilege, though there were notable exceptions. By the end of the dynasty, Ts'ao earned acclaim for identifying and elevating talent from less privileged backgrounds diverging from the hereditary practices of later dynasties like the Toba, which assigned ranks based on personal recruitment. Han commanders, regardless of noble lineage, were expected to meet high professional standards, of course, and were subject to a strict system of penalties. Although successful figures like Li Kuang experienced certain leniencies, he faced criticism for insufficient discipline and record-keeping. Nevertheless, Li Kuang instilled greater fear in the Xiongnu than the stricter Cheng Pu-chih, suggesting that effectiveness could take precedence over rigid adherence to protocol, which was a form of, bureaucraticism without necessary connection with sort of more stringent military logic. Now, communication on the battlefield relied on established methods such as flags, gongs, and drums, which had been used since earlier periods, of course, for coordinating troop movements. Although details on the operations of mobile armies are less documented compared to frontier garrisons, the Han's tactical strategies included ambushes, surprise flank maneuvers, and feints, which later became defining features of Ts'ao campaigns following the dynasty's collapse. Adhering to the principles of Sun Tzu and Wu-chih, Ts'ao varied his strategies to mislead adversaries and even authored a military manual for his commanders along with the earliest known commentary on Sun Tzu's work. Another commentary was later attributed to his rival Chu-ko Liang and found a place in the Taoist canon. During the Three Kingdoms period, armies utilized large numbers of flags and banners to create the illusion of greater size during feints, while military music, including drums, flutes, and martial anthems, played a vital role in motivating troops and intimidating enemies. Reports indicate that Northern Wei's flute music could transform fearful soldiers into brave ones, with some songs from Liang derived from northern melodies having survived the ages. This shows how spiritual, esoteric music was conceived, since the foundation of the Hans that literally, as we've seen, soaked their drums in blood, like the same red flag was part of the of that expression of force and a transcendental link with the divine through bloodshed, as it was true in tradition in general. We talked a bit about this also in other videos about the Chinese way to sacred royalty. In spite of this emphasis on strategy and military organization, a long-standing tradition of personal heroics among Han commanders continued to affect battle outcomes and career progression. During the Wu Revolt of 154 BC, for example, Quan Fu avenged his father by launching a bold raid into the rebel camp with a small contingent of mounted followers. Armed with a halberd, he inflicted casualties on 20 to 30 adversaries, returning wounded, but celebrated, ultimately earning a generalship from Emperor Ching-ti. Naturally, these stories are relatively shrouded in mythology to some degree. If you look at the nature of the sources, it's different from what, the Romans would have just written about themselves, or the Greeks, or even the Germans later on, etc. So the question is, at least in a historical context, what does this mean? If it does mean, of course, that the Han military was led by competent commanders, there is no doubt about the effectiveness of the Chinese military at this point. And of course, for these time standards, it was obvious to have still a champion kind of heroic ethos. This is true if you look, again, today made mostly the parallelism with Rome, because it's literally the easiest in this time frame, but it's basically the same. The Romans did train their generals in hand-to-hand combat. They had to be fighters. They had to demonstrate during their military career that they could. Caesar stormed walls in his youth. He was for them, it was normal just to show that. So celebrating it can be part of a story. if it is especially like, this guy killed 20 to 30 people, like, do we have to believe it for real? I mean, it's not like that there weren't warriors of that kind, and that this commander may have not been one of them, but let's say that what warfare is mostly about is something else. But we definitely do see also a relatively more, as we've seen, not confused necessarily, set of hierarchical interactions, etc. But in such a big, long history, first of all, you can find such anecdotes, especially in some sort of mythological form. Also, there are certain circumstances in which, as we've seen, the guy emerges from a lower background, becomes a king. It's more about the story. It would have happened. But it also depends on how certain people were raised. Like, if there isn't a straight sort of cursus honorum, so to say. For example, the Romans insisted very much on having a military experience in your youth and then passing to civilian life to a degree, even though, of course, the difference did not quite exist as we intended, especially given the imperial magistracies. Here, again, it seems more there's some kind of more feudal reality where you could even find such extremes of commanders that were more into hand-to-hand combat, at least in certain situations, and not in fixed positions of command, right? As we've seen, the Romans had this more uniform, more homogeneous, more framed, more disciplined system that tended not to screw up in terms, especially of hierarchy, of discipline. So even the commander-in-chief was not really meant to be even questioned about his validity as a fighter, because that was the 101 version of a Roman warrior. He was at that top level because he had to demonstrate other qualities. So again, this Han China does look something slightly more, archaic to some degree, or something more privatistic, something relatively less, say, controlled, but more fluid in many ways. And again, there would have been great warriors. I mean, if you pick at some certain Hellenistic rulers, Alexander himself, but many of his commanders, we talk about Pyrrhus, etc. These were fighting in the battle lines. The same is true for Caesar. We're talking for people who would have to consistently risk their lives in critical moments, right? So it's absolutely not a matter of fantasy. Actually, this 20 to 30 is people killed is often like the proof of being part of the elite. You can expect a real elite element, like, I don't know, Templars in the Middle Ages, to have been conceived to literally fight and die having taken out 30 people. That's something I often say. Here we have to understand the context rather, and understanding whether that actually tells us something about the system at large. In 194 AD, against Lu Pu, Ts'ao called for volunteers to penetrate enemy lines, which is also, how does that happen, right? Of course, this would have been some either kind of commanders, or there would have been some kind of tactic involving, the capacity of breaking through. This would have been always present to some degree, but there are many ways to war, and not necessarily a single notion, single anecdote is reflective of something more rigidly categorical about the war. Tian Wei from Chen Liu led the charge on that occasion, by the way, effectively wielding a halberd and forcing Pu's men to retreat, which is plausible. Again, there's nothing strange in the line of principle about it. Later, 538 AD, we are beyond, of course, our time, but Western Wei commander Ts'ai Yu dismounted to engage enemies on foot, killing several despite being encircled. And yielding in the face of offers for safe passage, he shot an armored opponent from 10 paces away, prompting a temporary retreat from the enemy, before leading a strategic withdrawal. again, if this happened, we have to imagine sort of more people involved normally. So it's obvious for these narratives to highlight the individual warriors. This is something we don't have really much in the West. All right, we have the plausible notion that great names, great commanders did fight, but it's not like Europeans needed to even claim that these guys had been such great individual fighters, because to them it was not that important to begin with. And so this Chinese perspective is interestingly different from a cultural point of view. In any case, altogether, we have seen today how Han tactics integrated the systematic use of, for example, missile superiority. So it seems at least it would have been likely balanced overall, but it was represented materially by the crossbow with adaptable tactics involving cavalry, chariots, all within a bureaucratically structured command system that balanced aristocratic privileges with merit-based exceptions, while theoretical military writings and formalized warfare evolved over time. The enduring tradition of personal valor ensured that individual bravery remained a powerful element on the battlefield, if anything, in order to encourage the others, so to say, enhancing the sophisticated doctrine of the year. And when the two things are sort of going in different directions, you know that there is actually a decline in the army. So it's there is a series of consideration we could make. I am glad to have made this video because it's just the first of a few, at least as an introduction to hand warfare. That at some point we will look at things a bit more in depth. But again, there isn't too much, right? There are beautiful studies, lots of speculations about also the macroscopical differences between the Han military and the Roman one, but the Han Empire and the Roman one. We again know much better Roman history, for that matter, in depth. But warfare is always like this, like military logic allows you to see things that could not have been documented historically, and so we have to be able to see ourselves beyond the anecdote, beyond the so in fact the isolated kind of evidence, and try to trace something way more consistent. This will be better highlighted in videos about battles and unit types. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.